We recently got the Japanese tank destroyers to World of Tanks, and we're soon getting British wheeled mediums. But what is beyond that? Apparently, flamethrower tanks are being tested on the Russian server currently. Do we really need that though? I'm here today to discuss with you what could be an interesting and fun tech tree. First off, we already have a shit ton of overpowered hull-down meta tanks in this game. So let's calm down on that front, shall we? So Zwhatsh, what is your idea of a tech tree that is both fun and balanced, and is not a hull-down monster line, and most importantly, it needs to be appealing and interesting somehow, so it's worthwhile for both wargaming and the player base. So, here is my idea. Actually, it's not my idea. It's something that many people have been proposing for many years actually, and that I strongly agree with. Italian super heavy tanks. Huh? Okay. Did the Italian army even have super heavy tanks historically? No, they didn't. But they certainly wanted to. Have you heard of a tank called the T-35? It was a Soviet heavy tank weighing a whopping 45 tons. It's very similar to the T-28 in appearance, but it's much larger and heavier. This tank actually existed, and Wargaming actually made a model of this thing many years ago. So maybe someday we'll see it in-game. During production, this tank was the result of a compromise of another tank concept, the T-39, which was a huge, super heavy tank with multiple turrets. They even made a wooden mock-up of this thing. But the project was deemed too unrealistic to finish, so it eventually became the T-35 instead. However, the idea for the T-39 didn't actually originate with the Soviets. Now, the facts here are kind of blurry, but according to some people on various forums on the internet, the T-39 project was inspired by an Italian heavy tank project called the Ansaldo Heavy Tank Project. The Ansaldo Heavy Tank Project was a 1930s tank project, so at the time there was no clear idea how a future war would play out. Or rather, people were expecting future wars to play out just like the First World War, with trench warfare. This unclarity is what made tanks such as the TOG-2 go into production. Huge, slow land ships that would be able to cross trenches, but with the newfound technology of fully rotatable turrets mounted at the top of the hull, thanks to the French innovation, the Renault FT, and also the Fiat 2000. Yes, the Italian beast tank. But we'll talk more about the Fiat 2000 later in the video. Now, let's focus on the Ansaldo Heavy Tank project instead. It was designed in stages, getting bigger and more crazy for every iteration. So to be clear here, this was only a concept, an idea, perhaps some blueprints. And if it was ever gonna be produced, it was only gonna be one tank, but its different iterations is what could form the Italian super heavy tech tree in World of Tanks. Let's begin at the Ansaldo P65. These images I have taken from a Russian blogger who works as an informer for Wargaming. However, since Wargaming left Russia because of the current conflict, I'm not sure if they're still in contact, but I will provide a link to his blog down below. Anyhow, this image that we're looking at and the upcoming ones are not the actual blueprints of the tank iterations. I'm gonna assume the original blueprints are extremely illegal for this Russian blogger to leak, so he has most likely made recreations, maybe with some creative liberties, of the original blueprints or drafts or whatever, to have something to show to Wargaming and the world for that matter. Also, since all of these iterations are the same tank, they all share the same armor values, which are very thin for being such a huge beast. It's 50mm in the rear and in the sides, and around 110mm in the front, with some extra armor in the turret. So if these tanks would be implemented in World of Tanks, the armor would need to be changed to non-historical numbers, tier for tier, to actually be viable in the game. I'm not gonna add any armor thickness suggestions in pure numbers for each tank, but I will add a weak spot layout suggestion for every tank, as that's more comprehensive in my opinion. Anyhow, the Ansaldo P65. This would be the proposed tier 7 tank for the tech tree, so I guess it would branch off from the P43 BIS. The Ansaldo P65 has a 107mm main gun, which is not super impressive, but not all too bad either. T150 at tier 6 and KV5 at tier 8 also has a 107mm gun, so if we would take the same alpha damage as those, it would be 300 damage. Decent, but pretty underwhelming for such a huge tank, but we'll get to the juice eventually. Let's let the tier 7 be somewhat underwhelming for now and jump to the tier 8. The Ansaldo GL 149. From here and forward you will notice a trend in the naming of the tanks. Ansaldo GL and then a number which represents the caliber of its main gun. So this proposed tier 8 tank would carry a 149mm main gun. The only other tank in the game that also carries such a weapon is the Hori 3 at tier 10, which deals 700 damage. Impressive. Very nice. That is quite a formidable force, but maybe you're not all that impressed. Maybe you're thinking, I feel like I've already seen this before. Kind of just feels like the Japanese super heavy line again. Well, let me introduce you to the quirk of the Italian super heavy proposal. Aside from having a monstrous main gun, they were also from this tier 8 tank and forward proposed to have a double barrel feature. So these tanks, were they to be implemented to World of Tanks, would be able to mount 2 different turrets and 2 different guns. One turret would support one huge gun for huge alpha, and the other turret would support a double gun for smaller alpha, but bigger combined alpha. The double barrel proposal for the Ansaldo GL49 has a 120mm gun, which would correspond to 400 alpha damage if you compare it to the other 120mm guns in World of Tanks, which means that the combined double shot would do 800 damage. Now we're talking. So much like the Czech heavy tanks, you would have a selection of 2 viable gun setups. Personally, I think this is a super exciting idea, and we're only at the tier 8 tank. Let's move over to the tier 9 tank. The Ansaldo GL152. Now this tank is not a huge leap from the previous one. 152mm guns in World of Tanks have either 700 or 750 alpha damage. So let's pick 750 to make it a bit more interesting. Since 50 alpha damage is such a small leap from the tier 8, let's assume it has relatively good DPM for its caliber. The double barrel setup is still sporting a set of 120mm guns according to the concept, just like the tier 8 tank, which would again correspond to 400 alpha damage. So let's again assume these guns have pretty epic DPM to make the tier 9 feel like an upgrade from the tier 8. Or tweak the alpha damage just for these guns in particular to 425. That would make the double shot do 850 damage, which would be 100 damage above the single shot alpha damage, just like the tier 8 tank. Sounds fair to me. Anyhow, let's move over to the tier 10 tank. The Ansaldo GL 203. Yes, 203mm. The Italians were like, let's build a battleship, bro. It's gonna look cool and stuff. I respect it. So yeah, the main gun of this is a 203mm gun. We don't have any guns in World of Tanks that are that huge, except for the 240mm gun on the T92 artillery piece, of course, but that doesn't count. This would be the first gun of its size mounted on an actual tank. So I have no idea what alpha damage to really propose here, but I do have a solution. Let's take a look at the double barrel setup first. The double barrel setup has 2 152mm guns according to the proposal, which would correspond to 750 damage each in accordance to other 152mm guns in World of Tanks. A double shot would then equal 1500 damage. Damn, that is a lot of damage. The double barrel setup on both the tier 8 and the tier 9 would have a double shot that does 100 damage more than the single shot alpha setup. So if we apply the same logic to this 203mm gun, it would do 1400 damage per shell. Lemao. I think every tank up until this tank has been relatively reasonable. It's at this one that things get real crazy. So how would you balance this tank? First of all, let's take a look at its size. Here is a 3D comparison of the Ansaldo GL 203, the Mouse, the Oni, the OI, and the TOG. As we can see, the Ansaldo is ridiculously huge. In fact, the entire line of tanks are. So I don't think they could have their historical proportions to actually function in game. They would have to be shrunk down a bit to not break the maps of the game. They could still be the biggest and the baddest of all the tanks, even larger than the Type 4, 5 and the Oni, but not this large. But their size would definitely still be a balancing factor. They would have basically zero camo and probably be very easy to hit and pen, as some piece of weak armor would always be exposed no matter how hard you try to angle or hide behind cover. And they would obviously be perfect targets for artillery. An important mention about the Ansaldo 213 in particular is that the single shot turret has a way different layout with way bigger weak spots than the double barrel setup, which could also be a huge balancing factor for that setup in particular. And they could also have very bad gun depression, and since they'd be so tall, any tank could just park beside them and get completely out of reach. The bigger main guns would probably have horrendous gun handling and horrible penetration, especially the 203mm gun. The guns of these tanks would probably only fire AP and HE, with the premium shell either being AP or HE. Most likely AP, as premium high explosive would probably be broken as f with these guns. Yep, that's the epic proposal. What do you think? A quick shout out to Picker and Sinovi Alexev, who I have taken huge inspiration from. They have made a fan-made tech tree. I'll link it down below. But wait, we can't forget about the most important part. What would a tier 8 premium tank be? Can't have a new tech tree without a tier 8 premium. Well, I'm honestly not sure. Wargaming would probably have to pull something out of their ass, which, to be fair, they're very good at, so would probably not be a huge problem. Or go back to their roots and hype up the tech tree with a low tier premium tank. The Fiat 2000. Let's go, baby. I didn't mention it in the beginning of the video for nothing. Actually, I just made this entire video so I could mention the Fiat 2000 again. I will never stop talking about this tank until Wargaming implements it into the game. Come on, Wargaming, do it. Come on. Do it right now, baby. Fiat 2000, let's go! Yeah! Come on, it's an epic idea. I'll pay you. Do you take GameStop gift cards? Alright. Now, this video is just speculation, just for fun. I don't think this will ever happen, but a super heavy enjoyer can always dream, can he? But do let me know what you think in the comments below. Have an epic day, and thanks for watching. Bye bye.